Good evening, everyone. I am Dr. Drew Lichtenberg, Associate Director and Resident Dramaturg at Shakespeare Theatre Company, and welcome back to the Shakespeare Hour Live. Those of you with the memory of elephants will remember that this was a program we started up during the pandemic as a way of keeping the spirit of theater and Shakespeare alive. And it hasn't gone away. We decided to keep the brand around for really special conversations, such as the one we're going to have tonight that were not possible to have in the theater. So before I talk a little bit about our amazing guests and the fascinating conversation that we're about to have, we've been having a little bit of it already before we started. I'd like to introduce my co-host and STC's director of Belonging and Equity, LeeAnét Noble. Hello, LeeAnét. Are you out there in the internet?
I am in the interwebs. Yes. Hello, Drew. It's so great to be back at Shakespeare Hour Live. It's been a while. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been. I think the last one of these we did was Here There Are Blueberries, the play by Moises Kaufman and Amanda Gronick and Tectonic Theater, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize last year. So pretty good company to be sharing.
Yes, and we also did one with Whitney White, who is now up for a Tony Award for Jaja's African Hair Braid. Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, you can go online to our YouTube page and look at the illustrious list of guests who have been with us in the past. Speaking of illustrious guests, tonight we are gathered together to celebrate the work of Mary Zimmerman, Tony Award winner, MacArthur Genius Grant recipient, whom the Washington Post in their most recent profile of her called a legendary director. And I was actually inspired to do this program tonight when Karen Ann Daniels, the artistic director at the Folger Theatre, and her colleague Beth Emelson generously invited me to see a production of Mary's Metamorphoses at the Folger Theatre on the same night that Mary was there in town rehearsing her own show for us, the Matchbox Magic Flute. And Mary got up on stage with the cast afterwards, thanked the company at the post show. It was sort of very moving to see Mary coming back to her own play, Metamorphoses, 20 years later. And it struck me that our two institutions, we ought to do something to acknowledge the remarkable synchronicity that's happening of these two classic theater companies, both doing works by Mary Zimmerman with our own world premiere and playing downtown at the Klein Theater, and Metamorphoses playing at the Folger. So that's my long-winded way of introducing the person themselves, Mary Zimmerman. Mary, are you out there? Are you with us?
Yes, here I am. Hello, thank you for that introduction, flowery introduction.
Yeah, well, it's really great to have you. Obviously, you have a connection to the Shakespeare Theater. I think starting back in 2004, it was when you did Pericles, and you've since done. I think that was 2 years after you did Metamorphoses and won the Tony Award for it. Is that right? Or was Metamorphoses even earlier than that?
Well, Metamorphoses started at school even before the turn of the century, I believe. And then it was in 2000, 2001 in New York. So yeah, around, it was before. Yes.
So like turn of the millennium, basically. So you did Metamorphoses in 99, 2000, 2001 type period that goes on to Broadway. We're then lucky enough to bring you to DC. And we've done a number of productions with you in the years since, most recently last season, The Notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci, which itself was an old production,
Yes.
Right? You had done in school.
Yes. Well, it was the very first thing I produced it myself. It was the very first thing in my life I did off campus. I was still a graduate student, but I went off campus and rented a space. And that was the very first version of Notebooks. Yeah. So it's old. Yeah.
And well, I have a lot more to say to ask you, but I want to introduce the other members of our panel. So thank you, Mary, for being here. It's so exciting. We're also joined by two members of the creative team for Metamorphoses at the Folger. First up, director Psalmayene, 24, an award-winning director, playwright, and actor, currently the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Playwright in Residence at Mosaic Theater, and a cabinet member at Studio Theater, where they're rehearsing their upcoming production of The Colored Museum by George C. Wolfe. Psalm has directed at theaters throughout the DC area and is also the host of the popular online interview-based series Psalm's Salon at Studio, which celebrates culture through a Black lens. Are you with us, Psalm?
I am with you. I am with you, Drew. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having us in this conversation.
Well, thank you for being here, and thank you for, if I may say, your really beautiful production of Metamorphoses at the Folger.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it starts with the text. I mean, you have to have ripe and rich material to sort of work from. So thank you, Mary.
I would say thank you, Ovid, and particularly David Slavitt, whose translation I used for my adaptation. It's true that when I was watching the show, I kind of felt like it's an early show of mine in a way, and it really relies heavily on that original text. Like all of that beautiful narration is Slavitt's. I have my contributions and the arrangement of it and the picking of it and juxtaposing of stories. But really, so much of that language is adapted from that beautiful translation.
Yeah, well, Psalm was saying before we started that Metamorphoses is itself, your Metamorphoses, Mary, is itself a kind of modern classic. It's interesting that it's been around now long enough that it's sort of entered the canon in these interesting ways. And you were sharing that it's produced every year around the country, if not internationally, by tons of amateur companies, high school companies.
Yes,
really
college.
A kind of entry point into Ovid's stories.
Yeah, I mean, it's I guess lucky for me that my own taste coincides with like university and high school curricula, because I think that's a reason. That's the Odyssey and Argonautica, all these classics I truly, truly love. But I do think that they dovetail well into like that sort of study of the classics in school and so forth. And yet hopefully these adaptations are fresh and relatable and fun for the students, as well as challenging and all that.
All right. Well, our last panelist, I've introduced Psalm and Mary, certainly not least. We are joined by the dramaturg on Metamorphoses at Folger, Faedra Carpenter. Dr. Carpenter is an associate professor, freelance dramaturg, and cultural critic whose work can be found in her critically acclaimed book, Coloring Whiteness, Acts of Critique in Black, as well as in a number of published anthologies and journals. Faedra also is a former resident dramaturg for Arena Stage and has worked at other local theaters such as Ford's, Mosaic, Theater J, the Kennedy Center, the Great African Continuum, and my own former stomping grounds, Baltimore Center Stage. Hello, Faedra.
Hello, hello. So nice to be here with everyone.
Yes, and this is a reunion sort of you and Psalm. You haven't seen each other in a while, is that right?
Haven't seen each other in a while. Always great to be in the same space.
Yes. It was since opening night, I think.
Right.
Celebrated the show, and then we were both off,
Right.
So it's such a theater relationship, right? You work so closely, opening night happens, you celebrate, and then you disperse for the winds to bring you back together.
That's right. That's right.
I also want to introduce Heather Jackson, STC's publicist, who is in the live chat right now, monitoring all the comments and questions that may be coming up. So hello, Heather.
Hello. Yes, I'm watching our live chat on YouTube. And if you have any questions, just drop them there and we'll pass them on to our fantastic panel here.
Okay, so Mary, I wonder if we could go back a little bit to, you were saying Metamorphoses, which started as a student production of yours, alongside maybe right after Notebooks or around the same time as Notebooks. You're making a face like
I never keep track of dates or years. I have no idea. I take your word for it. It was a few years after, I think, Notebooks. Yeah, the original Notebooks.
What do you think it was about these stories that first resonated with you, and now coming back to them, seeing Psalm's reimagining of Metamorphoses at the same time that you're working on bringing Matchbox Magic Flute into the world? What do you think it is about these stories, like the Magic Flute or like the Metamorphoses, that gives them such a longevity, that gives them so much fascination over the centuries, really, or if not millennia?
Well, oh gosh, that's a broad question and I can answer in so many ways. What drew me to them as a child was I sort of read all the fairy tales and was done with all the fairy tales. Like I couldn't sort of find any more or whatever. And my mother had Edith Hamilton's Mythology, kind of classic paperback, on her shelf. And I picked that up and it had little pen and ink drawings. And as soon as I started reading them, I recognized like all the adventure and monsters and tasks and trials and all of that of fairy tales and mystery and magic in a way. But I could tell they were for adults. And that actually, and they were dark, you know, they did not end happily. They ended poorly almost all the time, violently or with these violent metamorphoses and unwanted changes. And there, I think I intuited or felt a kind of symbolic adult and content and a kind of transgressive feeling of reading them as a kid. And, you know, there's a kind of direct through line between the pen and ink drawing of, there's, if anyone knows that little slim volume, there's a drawing of Psyche pulling the curtain aside and holding the lamp and looking down at Eros, which, by the way, isn't even Ovid, but Edith Hamilton wasn't doing just Ovid. She was doing Greco-Roman myths. And, you know, I basically was so struck by that image and like, why, you know, Psyche is Greek for the soul. Why is it forbidden for the soul to look directly on love? And, you know, I've done this show for 20 years and I don't have an answer to that, but somehow it draws me in. And a huge amount of my work has been bringing into the theater texts that were always oral to begin with. They come down to us in certain received print forms or standardized forms like Homer's Odyssey or the fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm, but those stories really precede those settling down into those texts. They were oral tales that were performed by a solo teller. They were passed around that way. And the theater, sometimes people say like, what gave you the idea to go to this or that? And to me, it's like its natural habitat of those oral stories is the air and is the theater. Although the way we're doing it is much more elaborate than like a solo storyteller. So almost everything I've done is sort of very old. And I guess I feel that those old texts, they're still around, not through a conspiracy of English teachers, because if enough generations actually were bored by them and hated them in school, they would fade away. But they earn their keep because they are always addressing the things about people that are eternal. And I think Psalm in his program note, or maybe Faedra, alluded to these kind of binaries in everyone's life of life and death and loss and gain and aging and youth. And all of those things are just, they don't go out of fashion, that we're all born mortal and have to deal with that. And everything we know is mortal and will pass or will change. And these stories are all about the inevitability of that. And if I'm sorry, I'm going on at quite length, but you know, our first preview of Metamorphoses, I do remember this date, was in New York City, was September 16th, 2001. So 5 days after September 11th. And there's so much in the stories that spoke exactly to that moment. But there was so much in the stories that speak to sort of every moment, as I think Psalm feels and his team feels. But there were certain lines, certain things that were so close to the bone. And I remember that night just being pressed to the back of my seat with the kind of force field in the room. I couldn't believe I was putting people through this in a way. You know, the first full story is that a man goes basically off to work on a bright sunny day and an enormous storm hits him. And his dying wish is, may my body be found. And if you were in New York at that time, that was the search. That was what was going on. And I can absolutely attest to the reality of catharsis. I felt it that night. That is to say that the audience, through artistic and aesthetic identification, through representation, travels through pity and terror and emerges on the other side kind of released. I felt it, and so that's my answer.
Well, so much to respond to in
Yeah,
that.
I can't even remember if I what all, but I think that's what you're asking. Why I'm
Yeah,
drawn to these, why I'm drawn to these. Yes.
yeah, and it's one of the things that's interesting is that these things that we associate with Ovid, like transgression and taboo and love and death, we think of as being quite Shakespearean themes. And of course,
Sure.
Shakespeare himself was deeply influenced by Ovid, right? And
Mhm.
adapting his,
Pyramus and Thisbe.
yeah, exactly.
Midsummer.
Although not Cupid and Psyche, which appears
Yeah.
in different metamorphoses from the ancient
Yeah.
world.
But that's the little play the Room Mechanicals are putting on. It's
Yeah,
Pyramus and Thisbe.
yeah.
Yeah.
At the center of that play is Ovid,
Yeah.
and metamorphoses, right? Transforming from a man into a donkey.
Yeah. And I often think of Shakespeare's line about we undergoing a sea change. I'm sure I don't have the full quote. That's why water was central to me originally with it, because you can't put an object in water without it being transformed. And water is a symbol of transformation kind of cross-culturally. And it itself is a changeable form. It can be a solid liquid or it can evaporate into steam. It itself has many forms.
Hmm. LeeAnét, one of the things Karen Ann Daniels said that night I saw Folger was that she saw metamorphoses as a very young person and was deeply changed by the experience. I know you're friends with Karen Ann. You've seen the show multiple times. I'm wondering how it resonated with you and if you have a question for our guests, especially our other panelists.
Yeah, I mean, well, being a dancer, one, and seeing how the story was told not only through words and song, that the way that the movement also was telling the story and continuing the plots and continuing the story, and also how you are completely surrounded by the production. You have movement happening all around you. It makes you turn, it makes you look, and you end up looking at other people as well as they're taking in the story. So such a beautiful display of storytelling. And I think of the African culture in particular, and how storytelling came from cultural experiences and celebrations with song and how all song and dance, and how all of these things connect, and even the moments for call and response. Um, Yes, yes, and shout out to Nick the Wonder, because the sound design, okay, it really took us on a journey through the diaspora, such a beautiful journey through the diaspora. Um, I wonder, Psalm and Phaedra, what those conversations with Karen Ann were like, and making the decision to embrace the diaspora and Black culture within the story.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in my early conversations with Karen Ann, we talked about what the potential makeup of the ensemble would be. So we talked about, possibly doing a diverse, multicultural cast that really looked and felt like DC. DC is very specific in that, we have a pretty big East African community, and then South American community, African American, white, and the idea of an all Black ensemble was also brought up early on. And to be honest with you, when that idea was brought up, I wasn't really sold, because my question was why would we do something like that in 2024? Haven't we moved beyond that? And then the killing of Tyree Nichols happened. And it was literally, when I got that news, that's when I knew we had to do this production with an all Black ensemble. And it really forced me to really confront in a different way America's impulse toward, lethal racism, and the fact that it's still ongoing, and the fact that Black people's humanity is still up for question. So I looked at this production, because of the universal, themes in it, and because it's so timeless, this play, I looked at this production as a really great opportunity to explore what it means to really celebrate and amplify and interrogate Black humanity. And then I also had to really ask myself, well, what does it mean to be Black? Because to say an all Black ensemble, everybody probably has a different definition or different understanding of what that means. So for me, I had to think about, well, what does that really mean for me? And for me, being Black really is about our relationship to Africa. That's what comes to my mind first. So that's what really started to inform our artistic decisions. We started, with African culture and art and architecture and clothing and fashion and dance and music. And then the production really sort of opened up after that. So yeah, that's where it started on my end.
Yeah, it's interesting, Faedra. I'm curious if you have more to add, but I'm struck by Mary mentioning the 9/11 attacks, and Psalm, you mentioning the murder of Tyree, and how amidst tragedy, especially American tragedy, you turn to these stories, you turn to art, right, for meaning and in some ways transcendence. It's very it's very moving to hear you speak to that. Yeah, Faedra, I'm wondering, if you can talk a little bit about.
Yeah, I'll just sort of
that.
underscore and be the amen corner for Psalm, but it was really intriguing for me to be invited to be on this production. One, exactly because of what Psalm was talking about when he told me it was Tyree Nichols' murder, right? And the whole idea of establishing, demonstrating, displaying, celebrating Black humanity. I had a question from an audience member, sort of a question, maybe a bit of a challenge, that sort of thing about why a Black cast. First of all, the question is why not? If this play of based on Ovid is about humanity in all its good, its bad, its beauty, its ugly. That's what this is about in so many ways, right? And I love, Mary, that this notion of catharsis, and I feel like it ends in some ways of hope and potential rejuvenation. This is what we need at this moment, and these incidents that we've been enduring and dealing with kind of heighten that. Also, what was fascinating to me is to think about Black humanity and Black history in terms of waterways, because so much of the narrative of Black people in the African diaspora does not acknowledge that, Africans were coastal communities and cultures, and due to systematic racism and different things that have happened through history, Black bodies in water is something that we often don't talk about, the disparities in drowning. But wait, there's other stories, there's other layers. And so bringing that rich history of water and water cultures, that's part of the African diaspora and all people. And so bringing that to bear via the water nymph that Psalm envisioned, and underscoring Mary's, all the rich metaphors of water. So there were so many interesting things for me to talk about, the specificity of African cultures, the diaspora, in the breadth of humanity, right? So.
Well, thank you for sharing that. It's interesting to think of the ways in which these stories evolve over time, the new meanings that they take on, and also the underlying meanings that continue to resonate. One of the things that we discovered while we were doing our audio video check is that Psalm and Faedra have not had a chance to meet Mary or talk to her. So Psalm and Faedra were like peppering Mary with questions about what was your process like on Metamorphoses? What did you do with this scene? What did you do with that scene? So I promised Psalm that I would, pass the mic to you and let you, be the amazing MC that you are, and ask Mary some questions. What do you want? What was driving you the most crazy when you were working on the show, rehearsing, saying, "Oh, if only Mary Zimmerman was here, what would I ask her?" What was that question?
Wow. Well, I spoke about how I was inspired by this by the legend of how Mary put together the scripts before rehearsals, like not long before rehearsals. And that was really inspiring to me in terms of how I approached our own rehearsal process and sort of how I prepared. But one question that I do have is about this idea of the water and the metaphor of the water, which is such a brilliant, genius idea. Like, do you remember the moment when you said, yes, this is how we're going to do this production? We're going to set it in the pool. And can you just talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. It's a little bit convoluted. I'm not sure, like the real accurate telling of it is not necessarily the most interesting. But I'd always wanted to do the Odyssey in water. I had a very early school production of the Odyssey, and that was maybe going to go forward somewhere, but it was going to be like a couple years. And I thought, well, in the meantime, why don't I just try some myths in water? So in other words, it was never, I'm doing Ovid's myths, oh, how shall I do them? Let me think. It was myths in water. And I think there's a bunch of reasons for that. It's a, very maritime culture. Greco-Roman culture is thousands of islands. And again, like there's something right about the sort of metamorphoses. I'm not the first person to set things in water. I had seen Pina Bausch's, I think it's called Arion, she floods the stage with about like 6 inches of water, and it was so astonishingly beautiful. So and there have been I know that there have been other productions before me, but this one seemed not arbitrary. Do you know what I mean? Like it seemed really, really justified. So it was that. It often with a show, I do it because I have an idea how to do it. And that's the same with how I pick the stories in shows that are kind of anthologies, the way this one is, or like a fairy tale show is. They're episodic. I have I have a visual thought that comes comes with the idea. Like they're absolutely linked. Like I knew when I wanted to do Magic Flute, it was instantly a little miniature Magic Flute. Like it was that. It wasn't like I want to do flute, how should I do it? So it just came with it. This is gonna, I don't mean to shift the conversation, but I was so inspired by something Faedra said, both about waterways and how it's the oceans that connect the lost land and the new land, right? That's the road there and the road back. So I was very moved by that, but also the thought of the hopefulness of the last story. And to cycle back to like when we opened Metamorphoses in New York, a lot of things seemed very, very of the moment. But to me, the most important line in the play over the years, believe it or not, has come to just be the line when the old and impoverished couple set the table for who they think are beggars, but who are the gods in disguise. And they're bringing on their little modest honey and their little this and their little that. And then there's a line, and a basket of ripe apples. And I'm not sure if it's from the Slavic translation or not, but the line is, remember how apples smell? And everyone on stage inhales and tries to remember that. And right after 9/11, the discourse was everything's changed, nothing's the same, the whole world is different, everything will be different forever and ever from now on. And that's neglecting the entire natural world. That sentiment only applies to things that are under the consciousness of human beings, but there is the abundance of the natural world. And that line, 2,000 years old, could still be true, that apples have a certain scent, and we mostly all know what that is, became a really central line to me, and to this day is. And on opening that on Broadway, my cast gave me a crystal bowl full of apples, live, real apples, with the engraving of that line. So I kind of hijacked it and circled us back to that, but I just wanted to comment on what Faedra said.
Well, and it's interesting how one of the frames for the show is Midas, right? Is this kind of very Edith Hamilton-y intro Greek myth type story of like, oh yeah, King Midas and the gold and everything. But then when you see it embodied and you see it come back, you realize that in some ways it's the Greeks writing about, or the Romans and the Greeks writing about the same thing, of the ignoring of the natural world in favor of these man-made symbols of money and gold and metal, right? These things that have an imaginary meaning, but are not actually the stuff of life and death and humanity and family. And I was very struck by that when I saw the show at the Folger. Psalm and Faedra was how much pathos there was in that story, how it was in some ways the central story of the entire evening. And you know, it's not kid stuff at all, or it is kid stuff, but kid stuff in the way that kids can speak the most profound truths and observe in a way that adults are too cynical or jaded or, you know, immersed in their own nonsense, right, to really take note of. That's not a question. That's more of an observation.
Yeah, no, but I would 100% agree. I mean, the moment at the end when, you know, Midas gets a chance to, you know, finally embrace his daughter again. I mean, heartbreaking, like shattering in the best way. And every single time we did it, it never lost that charge and that sense of, wow, right. There's a seed of redemption that I think we all yearn for. Everybody who's made any kind of mistake, we all want to be redeemed, right? So I mean, it was just a brilliant way to sort of hold that idea. And that's one of the things, again, just to talk about just the script. I mean, it's, you know, a brilliant enough idea to say, okay, you know, we'll set this play in water. But what really struck me about the play was just the text and the language and sort of the order of the myths and how and the ebb and flow, to stick with the water metaphor of the story is just, I mean, it's there. So I think our job was really to have, you know, our own interpretation, but to also be true to the text and just to amplify the ideas that were already there.
You know, Sam, I've been with this show forever, and it has never occurred to me until hearing you speak. It has never occurred to me that perhaps, you know, that final moment, and I know not everyone's seen the show, but the very first story is Midas acquiring the gift and actually accidentally turning his daughter into gold. And then he's told that there's a chance if he washes his hands in a particular river that she'll come back. And then he goes away, and then we do the whole show and we do the concluding lines. And then suddenly he appears, and generally the audience has forgotten him. And it just has never occurred to me before that it's the one instance where the change is reversed. You know, and
Yep.
that's miraculous, because the whole story has been this inevitable, violent change that we all go through in our lives. We don't want, you know, although it might be part of our survival or whatever. But that, and it's all silent, there's no language. It provides an actual image that this terrible catastrophe could actually be, like, there's this hope of reverse. And I've also never thought of this before, but there's a spiritual dimension to that. You know what I mean? That, like, somehow, I mean, are they meeting beyond the river? You know, are they meeting somewhere else? Which I've never thought of I've never thought of that until this conversation. But it's always been it's always been super moving. And even I, who wrote it, forget, like, even I am surprised when he turns up again, because there's really been no reference to him for, you know, an hour and a half. And we kind of don't know that second part of the story mostly.
Right.
The myth is just like, oh, the guy accidentally turns everything to gold. Be careful what you wish for at the end, you know, but that is part of the story. I am proud of that one too. I will say that the original story is like 5, 6, 8 lines long. It's almost nothing. And it's kind of elaborately done in the script. Something about it moved me, obviously.
Yeah, I just want to say I love hearing what you're saying, Mary, because you and Tony Thomas, our fantastic choreographer, talked consistently about the ritual of the end, right? And that it had to be ritualistic. And hearing what you said, Mary, about smelling the apples, now it's just seeing me. It is of the earth. It is of the water. It is that purity, the basics that cleanses and sets things right again.
The myths are astonishingly contemporary in terms of, like, there's one, Erisichthon, where it's just a huge warning: don't exploit the earth, don't chop down every tree you see. It's a really bad idea. And symbolically or not, he's cursed with hunger after he does it. And it seems like it could have been written by, eco warriors 10 minutes ago, but they had that wisdom even then. Just really tend to the natural world. It's your life as well. You'll lose your own life if it loses its.
Well, one of the other really interesting, fascinating things about your work, Mary, and this production of Metamorphoses, and also the Matchbox Magic Flute at STC, is there's a depth, but there's not a heaviness, by which I mean there's a lightness, a whimsicality, a sense of being on its feet, right? And metamorphic in that. And LeeAnét was mentioning the dance, how immersive the dance is. And music and dance, these elements of theater that Aristotle puts at the bottom, right, as the least important parts after plot and character, are so alive in your work. And I don't want to strain too much, but Mozart's opera is also kind of about magical transformations, or in some ways about what you're saying about Midas, the reverse transformation, the transformation from a world of magic into one of human reality, right? That the prince and princess in that have to undergo these bizarre rituals or tests, which has something to do with Freemasonry, although I've never really understood what it has to do with Freemasonry in the original. And in this production, this new production, it becomes very clear that it's a kind of a personal journey of consciousness. It's about seeing what is real in front of you instead of being enchanted by illusions.
That's, the basis of so many of the old stories and of Shakespeare, all of his young lovers and all the comedies. You have to, you meet and you fall in love, but you're really not ready for it. And so you have to undergo trials, and you have to grow up and go through that transformation. You do have to go through that metamorphoses and then meet in maturity. That's just so prominent in Shakespeare, for sure. But they also, the tales, I guess, have in common, I mean, there's even a trial by water, I guess, but what you were saying about dance and music and laughs, are really, really important. That's a huge part of life. And I think works of art that turn away from that too much are not, they're not the whole picture. And the pleasure of the audience, should be central to our concern. And there's intellectual pleasure and spiritual pleasure and aesthetic pleasure. But we have to look out, we do have to be entertaining. Also, audiences love virtuosity. That's something we love. We love it in sports and in entertainment, singers, great singers, and we love it in the theater. We like a display of things that people can do well. We like that. It's affirming,
Well, and also you were talking before we started broadcasting about multiplicity, right? The doubling that is such a feature of your work as well. We love it. We love surprise, and we love it when Papagena emerges from one of the ladies, right? Or these sudden and unexpected theatrical doublings that seem to have a kind of a meaning that is extrinsic to the text itself, but that can be experienced in performance, which is such a rich part of the shows.
Performance is really good at doing a lot of things simultaneously in a way that, maybe reading isn't. Many things can be happening on stage at once that are each inflecting the meaning. and giving us very complex pleasure, I think. So there's simultaneity in the theater, two things at once, kind of easily, upstage and downstage, left and right. We can have our cake and eat it too in the theater. We can be super funny and then be super sad and moving. I sometimes think the funnier you are, then the sadder parts are going to be, So it's important to all my work. And I recognized in Psalm like this great theatrical flair. In my direction, when we meet Orpheus, the greatest of all singers, it's just on his wedding day and it's already kind of somber. But in Psalm's production, we get to see Orpheus performing. And I bet, obviously, because you had an actor who could do that, you know what I mean, in an electrifying kind of way. It's great theatrical flair.
Well, for those who
Well,
haven't seen it,
yeah.
Orpheus is a kind of combination of Michael Jackson and James Brown and Prince, right?
Yep. And well, that was inspired by your stage directions, because you said maybe we see Pandora and Atalanta or
That's
something
right.
like that.
That's right.
So I said, oh, well, maybe means that maybe we do, maybe we don't. But then I started to think about like the equivalent sort of, gods, or who in, Black cultural mythology, who are like the deities. Orpheus is a musician, and that also came from the actors, them leaning into sort of him being a musician. So it started with your text, then being sensitive to the room, and then thinking about dramaturgy and having a great dramaturg is saying, okay, well, who are these people that would make sense in this world? And that's how we came up with that.
I think I kind of sensed that you were, that's your nod to those. There's these little tiny interstitial moments of myth sometimes in the text. And I'm glad that you brought up, I do say maybe. When I first started publishing my plays, I didn't want to be prescriptive. And I often say they might or maybe. And then, it's an interesting question. Like, so many fantastical things happen in the stories that I stage. Do I say, Hercules is walking by the shore and a sea monster appears? Or do I say in the text, Hercules is walking across the stage and two actors under a green cloth, each holding an eyeball to make a monster appear? And I always decided on, I would call it the semiotic, what's indicated, that is to say a sea monster. And then my mother said, but Mary, maybe people want to know how you did it. And so I did appendices in a lot of my shows that say, here's how we did it. Here's how we did the sea monster. But I, as a director myself, and I, by the way, identify myself as a director way more than I identify myself as a writer, way more. I think that's where my real whatever is. As a director myself, I just don't want it to be too prescribed. What's the fun? There's no fun, right? There's no fun. So you want to find it yourself and have your own version of how the thing is manifest on stage.
Well, I totally got that from reading the script, and it's a very director-friendly script. I said, oh, well, this is a director's playground, the way it was written.
I love
because
that.
It was very open.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want it to be that way because, well, I'm fighting against my natural controllingness, because when I'm a director, I am pretty controlling. But I would very much dislike some author, director perched on my shoulder like a raven, telling me what to do. So I do identify with the director very, very strongly.
LeeAnét, it looks like you have a question or thought.
It was just a thought. I was just thinking about the openness of the pieces and the work and the writing, and even in your process, Mary, how you jump in and let it flow. And you said there's a messiness in there. And I was with some of the cast members earlier today from Matchbox Magic Flute, and they were saying, you would think that at this point that all the lines and everything they would know what everything means by this point in the process, but they make so many new discoveries as they go along, and according to what's happening in life, and wait, oh, that means they have so many aha moments. There's so much opportunity, even as you go on and on, years to come, when the next generations are doing metamorphoses, like just the new discoveries that are happening. I think that's such a beautiful part of
this really interesting relationship, right, between the broad and the specific, or the particular and the general. It makes me think of Exit Pursued by a Bear in Shakespeare, right? Like he doesn't explain how the bear is made. Is it a real bear? Is it a trained bear? We have our theories, right? But it's there for the director to and the ensemble to invent. And another similar aspect to your production, Psalm and Faedra, were the accent work, right? It felt like there was West Indies in there. There was African inflections or West African. It was very specific, right? Who had dreadlocks and had a kind of reggae dialect, which it kind of enhanced in some ways the timelessness or universality. There's that paradoxical relationship between the particular and the universal. And I'm wondering, Faedra, dramaturgically, what those conversations were like, and figuring out who has what kind of dialect, or who belongs to what part of the diaspora.
Well, I can actually ask Psalm to talk about that, because for Psalm, right, he allowed the actors to experiment a lot, but leaning into this is diasporic, right? So if I can throw it to Psalm, but I would like to also talk a little bit more about specifics and nuances after he's done. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it started with actor choices, and then we said, oh, well, if you're a family, then it would make sense for you all to be from the same region. But if you're a father, you could very well have an African accent, and your daughter could have a more Americanized accent, as a first generation person. So we had those types of conversations. And then even thinking about like Aphrodite has a Puerto Rican accent. And that was a conversation that we had about like, well, what does it really mean to be Afro-Latina? Like, and how will that translate to the audience? So yeah, this was something that we spent a lot of time experimenting with different versions of accents and making sure that all the accents landed the way we wanted them to land.
Yeah. Up until previews all the way through, right? But I just want to also give a nod to Psalm and sort of go back to what you were saying, Drew, about nuances and the specifics that happen with the imagining and the directorial imagining that audience may not see. I call them Easter eggs, but something that gives birth to a greater thing. So for instance, and I'll have some, there is the tableau, the prologue in the beginning, but very famous painting by Ernie Barnes, The Sugar Shack, informs what that audience does, right? Kaya Dunn, the intimacy choreographer, it was images of Carmen Jones and Harry Belafonte in intimate moments that informed what the actors did. Or even that amazing, trio of Michael Jackson. Hey, we can think about that 1983 iconic moment where James Brown brought Prince and Michael Jackson on the stage. So it's the Easter eggs. It's also a gift if you happen to know them. But if you don't know them, it still resounds, it still presents beautifully. But knowing also that the actors are working with those things and bringing that magic to the stage.
Well, and speaking of Easter eggs, there's so many of those in Matchbox Magic Flute, at least to my untrained eye. It feels like, Mary, you're engaged in this very accessible, democratizing project of making this opera a piece of musical theater that's accessible, right, in a theatrical context. Mm-hmm. But also it's inspired by this kind of a very, very esoteric world of Singspiel and
of grand opera.
Opera.
A very, like, almost the first image I had for Matchbox Magic Flute is that I wanted the whole audience, over the heads of the audience, to be all of these little miniature chandeliers that we would raise, because at the Met, it's a 100-year tradition. There are these chandeliers that hang down, but right before the show starts, they raise and dim. Not every show, and often not mine, because my lighting designer says they cast shadows on the show curtain, and so I can't use them, so they're up to begin with. But that got, through the magic of budget reduction, that got, turned into 3 chandeliers, which in Chicago didn't even raise, but here they do. And there's also a real echo of European theater, specifically French, of striking that cane to begin. I saw shows in Europe when I was young, and I was so struck by that ritual, this knocking, this super loud knocking that actually traces back to people on the right side of the stage backstage calling to people on the left, "Are you ready?" And there used to be 12 knocks and all this stuff, but it's maintained as a ritual. And also just quoting oldie-timey theater. I love oldie-timey theater conventions, painted scenery, footlights. I just love all that. And I love the old time value of just giving everything you can to the audience, just giving as much as you can to the audience, as much visual, oral delight, to being as generous as possible. Yeah. Yeah, I love all that stuff. All the old mechanics of the theater, I love,
Yeah, well, I think it comes through. It's really a love letter or a tribute to the theater, to the
Yeah. But I
physical.
wanted the opera to be, in a way, degraded. And the particular story, Flute is the opera to do that with. And it does have a kind of theatrical background. The librettist was a theater producer, and he played Papageno and all the rest of it. But I just wanted it to have an intimate feel, the way we have in the theater a bit more. Grand opera can be so alienating and so giant, and you're in such a big space, and it's so expensive, and just everything, the weight of it is huge. And I just wanted to get down to that, the pleasure of that crazy story and those beautiful characters and the beautiful music, for everyone, to be for everyone.
Well, yeah, it's a funny thing how Magic Flute was a new work, kind of like Metamorphoses was a new work at the time. And yet it was tapping into these very common through lines, right, of
Sure.
transformation, metamorphosis.
Sure.
My favorite thing that I discovered working on the program note was that Schikaneder, the librettist, was a Shakespeare actor. He was a traveling performer of Shakespeare.
I didn't even know that. That's fantastic. Yeah.
Was he doing his version of Puck in A Midsummer Night's Dream when he was playing Papageno or something like that?
Yeah.
And I think Mozart only mentions Shakespeare like once in his brief life. Seeing a production of The Tempest that he didn't like, So
oh my goodness,
these funny little connections. Well, we have a few minutes left, so I'm wondering if a good note to close on might be to talk about myth itself and a favorite myth, a myth that has touched you, a myth that resonates with you in the moment. Everyone's making a puzzled expression.
I can speak to it. I still, I love all the myths that I chose. But just as a new one, I teach at Northwestern University, and I give an assignment it used to be my performance art class. Now it's called Staging the Unusual. And they have to stage a myth in one image using using light in a significant way and no language, and just a striking image. So for instance, one performance was someone had an old TV, with the big heavy casing that they had, and he had it plugged in. It was just like the snow, and he walked by and glanced and then stopped and just stared at that thing for like a couple minutes, and it was Medusa being turned to stone by the television, which is a brilliant metaphor for what media does to us. It does turn us to stone. So that's like an example, but to say favorite myth, so I did that just a few weeks ago, and on the first day I give an example, and so I found some, and I found this one, and is it Hyperion? And I think it's the moon. It's a young, handsome boy. The moon falls so in love with him, and she can only see him at night or whatever. So she casts a spell on him that he is always asleep all his life. And I thought that struck me so profoundly. It's so sad. It's so sad that this unwanted love, this obsessive love, paralyzes the life of this boy. And I just was, so it's not a favorite myth or whatever, but it's just like I'm always surprised by how like the psychological and symbolic content in that feels so rich to me and so smart and so sad. So that's just one that just comes to mind.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Mary. That exercise sounds really, really amazing and inspiring, like one of those classic school exercises that just is like what you're reaching for the rest of your career, trying to get back to graduate school. I certainly can relate. Faedra, Psalm, is any story from Metamorphoses or anything currently jogging your brain?
Yeah, I mean, the myth of Apollo and Phaeton in Metamorphoses. I mean, that's one that has a particular personal resonance for me as someone who, has had a fractured relationship with my own father. I mean, that one, and then the humor in it. We talked about like the levity in Mary's work, and the humor in that scene is just great. But then there's also really a powerful foundation of like seriousness that's also in that piece. And then just the myth of the resurrection, right? Like that's just a myth that I feel like is just and endlessly powerful and endlessly inspiring. This idea of rebirth and being able to sort of rise out from either actual death or out the ashes. So that's one myth that resonates deeply with me too.
I'm so going to be a hog and jump in. Don't you feel, Psalm, that the curtain call is a symbol of the resurrection? I always feel that we've seen these characters die, suffer, whatever in every show. And then they come out and smile at the audience and bow. I always feel that it is a symbol of the resurrection. And I resent actors who won't smile, who won't drop the act. Do you know what I mean? Because they're saying, here we are, we're still alive, it's just us.
Yep,
Yeah.
that's such a great point, and now I'll never look at a curtain call the same now. I mean, that's
related
great.
to this though, but I had a great teacher in graduate school named Eleanor Fuchs, who unfortunately passed away last week. She was a great theater critic, and she used to argue that after the Christian theology in plays like by Shakespeare, Fortinbras is a kind of resurrection, right? Or Malcolm in the Scottish play, that you have a kind of happy ending at the end of tragedies, as she called it, the Christian uptick in dramatic structure, which this conversation is making me think of, and the dear Eleanor Fuchs, who was definitely a mentor and a hero of mine. Quickly, we have 2 minutes. Faedra, LeeAnét, myths.
I would be making it up if I named a myth. But I just think of honestly the mythologies even of my family. I have a cousin who often talks about our family stories and the mythologies, and that's what I'm leaning on and thinking about, and how those still influence us and what we can learn from them, and the magic of our own personal stories, even beyond what we might get in the books.
Yeah, and similar to Phaedra, versus a particular story, I think of how mythology was connected to faith and religion, and how this was a way of understanding and trying to figure out how we work and how people work. And I think connecting this to what Mary has done with this piece and what Psalm has done with this piece, how it's something that does connect us all. We do all have the same questions. We are all made of water. We all are connected in so many ways. So I think of how they were seeking for those connections to the earth, to what's happening around us, and how we found some connection through art in this way.
Well, what a wonderful series of comments to close this conversation about the brilliant work of Mary Zimmerman tonight, celebrating Zimmerman. Thank you to our brilliant panelists, Psalm, Faedra. Thank you, LeeAnét. Also, I want to share with you the exciting news that both of these shows must close this Sunday. Matchbox Magic Flute at STC and Metamorphoses at the Folger. And with that in mind, Psalm?
We got extended until the 23rd.
Oh, extended to the 23rd.
Yes.
You're right, because I was about to plug the generous promotions team at the Folger would like to invite all of the people viewing the Shakespeare Hour live to use the discount code MARY20 for 20% off to attend the final 4 performances of the Folger next week. So you heard it here from the horse's mouth himself. Use that discount code MARY, MARY 20, and hope to see you all at the theater soon. That's it for me, Drew Lichtenberg, signing off. Thank you all, and good night.